Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. It's so good to see so many of you with us live here today. My name is Rabbi Melanie Lavav. I have the honor of serving as the Executive Director of Shomer Collective. I am thrilled to welcome you all, hundreds of professionals and lay leaders from across the Jewish end-of-life field, or as we say, working at the intersection of Jewish life and end of life, who registered for today's convening as we talk together today about death Jewishly. As you know, we have an incredible lineup of keynote speakers and networking, and we're so glad to have you join us for whatever parts of today you can. So I'll review our agenda and logistics in just a moment, but I want to start with why we are here today. As many of you know, too many of us wind up in crisis, whether ourselves or the people we serve in our communities or both, when we haven't faced the reality of our mortality, when we haven't talked about or planned for the inevitable. This isn't a uniquely Jewish problem. It's a contemporary challenge felt acutely here in the United States and Canada, and I imagine in Portugal and the places that you're all located. And our question is there a uniquely Jewish response? And Shomer Collective's belief is that, yes, there is a Jewish response to this idea of the need to plan for end of life. It's not enough to normalize conversations around end of life. Our communities must learn to talk about death Jewishly. This happens through our training of community leaders, our partner engagements, as well as our individual offerings. Together, we can empower more people to benefit from the wisdom of Jewish tradition about life and death. To share a bit more, I'm excited to introduce my partner in our sacred work and Shomer Collective's board chair, Lindsay Bressman, joining us from New York City. Lindsay.
Welcome. I'm watching the chat and the numbers pour in and all the people that I want to contact after. I'm really excited about this. So first and foremost, welcome. Welcome to a communal conversation on how we can embrace our finite existence on this earth and consequently celebrate life. I'm so grateful to be here with all of you, and truthfully, I just wish it were in person, but I know that's unrealistic given that we have people from so many different states and cities and countries. We are a select group of people who are perhaps a little kooky and are drawn to the morbid cosmos. But my theory is that it's because we all know that death is real and it's universal, and you can't avoid it by covering your eyes. Not only that, I think many of us have realized either personally or professionally or both that coming close to morbidity, the process of grave illness, dying, and death is deeply sacred. Shomer Collective is dedicated to talking about death Jewishly and empowering conversation with greater confidence and less fear. Our mission is to leverage Jewish wisdom to transform communal culture around death and dying, fostering proactive planning and robust support systems for end-of-life moments. We envision a world where end-of-life matters are spoken about openly, thoughtfully, and frequently, creating opportunities for more people to engage with Jewish tradition, values, and practices. These experiences can be transformational, having an impact not only on the individual, but on the whole family and community for years to come. I join you today in my honored role as chair of Shomer's advisory board. 4 years ago, after a couple decades working in healthcare as a social worker, a public health researcher, and clinic administrator, I brought to life my dream of becoming a hospital chaplain. What I've learned after countless interactions with patients, families, staff, and even policies is that spiritual care, whether that's an official religious ritual or a bedside chat about Otis Redding, is an integral part of physical, mental, and medical care. A recently published 10-year study by Harvard School of Public Health highlighted this reality. Quote, spiritual health is critical across all ages and diagnoses, with particular importance for patients with serious or chronic illness. It influences key outcomes such as quality of life and medical care decisions. In life's hardest moments, Judaism can be a doorway. Jewish ritual can be an island within the raging sea of grief, or a companion through illness. With the death of a loved one comes a cascade of sorrow, exhaustion, anxiety, fear, anger, loneliness, and Jewish tradition meets us precisely in that abyss. And yet, to some, Jewish death customs and prayers may feel unfamiliar, exclusive, disconnected from one's theology or lifestyle. Complex family dynamics, estranged relationships, blended families, multiple faiths, or varying connections with religion can affect decision-making and implementation of the Jewish customary rites of passage for a mourner. People live far from their families of origin, making burial, funeral, and Shiva coordination complicated. There are financial, legal, and logistical barriers to ensuring arrangements meet both the wishes of the deceased and the needs and preferences of the mourners. Over half of diaspora Jews are not formal members of institutions that offer integrated support for organizing death-related practices. A culture celebrating privacy and self-sufficiency has brought rise to a strained and awkward interaction with any form of behavior that feels like obligation. And finally, Jews and many other ethnicities and cultures can be quite superstitious, avoiding talking about critical matters of death and dying and missing opportunities to communicate wishes with family and friends. This is where we turn to you. How might we, this several hundred group of people who work in this field, bring Jewish end-of-life ritual to more individuals and families? How might we lower the barriers? How might Jewish wisdom and tradition encourage more intentional and end-of-life planning? How might we strategically weave talking about death Jewishly or reverently spiritual in any capacity into existing community institutions, synagogues, schools, JCCs, camps, hospitals, work environments, corporations, financial and legal companies, donor, advised funds, trust and estates, attorneys, insurance companies, and more? These are only some of the questions we at Shomer wrestle with and seek to create programming to address. We hope that this convening creates a space for diverse parts of the field to come together, all focused on the goal of connecting and generating ideas to spark innovation around end of life in the Jewish world and beyond. And now some gratitude to our convening sponsors for helping to make this gathering accessible to you all. The Network of Jewish Human Services Agencies, Ariel Jewish Healing Center, Kavod V'Nichum, Fitting Tribute Funeral Services, INELDA, the International End-of-Life Doula Association, and eMotion, Grief Support Through Movement and Community. Please take some time after this convening to check out their organizations. We are very grateful to the philanthropic foundations and individuals who enable us to do this sacred work. The founders of Shomer Collective from the Natan Fund, who launched this idea, the current members of our board, our fiscal sponsor, Upstart, and the entire staff team. I will now turn it back over to Shomer's formidable Executive Director, Rabbi Melanie Levav.
Thanks so much, Lindsay, and thank you all. To those of you who are still joining us, who have just joined us, it's really an honor to be here with you today. So I'm going to share just a few words before we launch into our first keynote to set the stage for what to expect today, starting with our aspirations. These are the values that will help shape our collective experience throughout our time together at our convening. Presence, be here when you're here, right? I probably have 35 windows open. I don't know about you, but I'm going to try to stay focused on this one today. Kindness, we have many voices, all are welcome, recognizing the differences that enrich our community. And our intentions today, we intend to ground ourselves in the Jewish wisdom that supports our sacred work and recognize that we're part of something bigger, to connect to other professionals and lay leaders, as you're already doing in the chat, who are doing this sacred work alongside us, and to generate ideas to spark innovation around end of life in the Jewish world. To ground our learning together, today I want to offer a few words of timely Torah. When the world feels chaotic, finding ourselves in Jewish place and time can help to ground us in the wisdom of our tradition. In our annual cycle of reading the foundational stories of our people, we find ourselves this week reading about Abraham and Sarah, first attending to the three visitors who appear at the entrance to their home, welcoming them in, feeding them, and accompanying them as they continue on their way, on their journey. It's that idea of accompanying the visitors as they continue on their journey that I want to elevate for our learning today. It says in Hebrew, Abraham holech imam. Abraham walked with them. He went with them after attending to their needs, feeding them, take a load off, here's a drink. He accompanies them. He walks with them as they continue beyond his tent on their journey. It's a simple yet perhaps profound act to walk with someone. I can't fix the brokenness of our healthcare systems that maybe have failed you. I can't bring back your loved one who has died, but I can. You can. We can walk with you, accompany you, to be with you in the brokenness, to walk with you in your grief. The contemporary spiritual teacher Ram Dass, Sanskrit for servant of God, born Richard Alpert, is credited with the phrase, "We're all just walking each other home." His book, Walking Each Other Home, explores the ways in which we can be present with dying and shows us how death gives us an unparalleled opening to cultivate gratitude, compassion, and even joy in the simple beauty of living. Chaplains, many of you here today, are taught to embody a ministry of presence. It's the act of showing up, of being present to another human in your suffering, in your longing, in your seeking, your anger, your hope. Shomer Collective's founders blessed us with the name Shomer, guard, from the one who sits with the met, with the deceased, from the time of death until burial, to evoke that image of sacred accompaniment of the soul. Talking about death Jewishly, the wisdom of our tradition supporting us, accompanying us in facing the realities of our mortality. Maimonides, the great philosopher, physician, and rabbi of the Middle Ages, reminds us that it's a positive commandment, an active responsibility to visit the sick, to accompany guests, to attend to the tasks of caring for and burying our dead. These are the things we do that have no measure, no limit, according to Jewish law. It's not simply a task on the to-do list. No, these are things that cannot have a limit. Their measure is only understood in the way it is experienced by the ones we accompany. Psychologist Adam Grant, in writing about the opportunities and risks of artificial intelligence, reminds us that as human beings, one of our fundamental motives is to matter. Mattering, he says, is not just about feeling valued by others. It's also about feeling that we add value to others. How might we live more deeply into the Jewish idea of accompaniment as a sacred obligation without limit? Perhaps Grant's reminder, mattering, what matters most, is the way in which we show up for one another without measure. This is in large part why we were so drawn to Sarah Wildman's stirring accounts of the ways in which she and her family were and were not accompanied on their journey through her daughter Orli's illness and death. What mattered most to Orli and her family, and how might we learn from their story to help us do better in showing up and accompanying those in our own circles? Sarah Wildman is an editor and writer for opinion at the New York Times. She has received numerous grants and competitive fellowships and wrote Paper Love, a book published by Riverhead Penguin, while a visiting scholar at the International Reporting Project at Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. Sarah will share the story of her daughter Orli's life and death and the gaps and disappointments she faced in seeking support along the way. Her keynote will invite us to ask, what do we do when the systems meant to care for us around death and dying fall short? Our keynote with Sarah will end with a question and answer session moderated by Shomer Collective board member Gabby Birkner. Gabby is a Los Angeles-based journalist with 2 decades of newsroom experience. She's the co-founder of Modern Loss, a content platform about grief and loss, and co-author of Modern Loss, Candid Conversations About Grief, Beginner's Welcome, published by HarperCollins. Sarah, all yours.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Levov and the Shomer Collective, and Gabi for being with me during this. I'd like to thank you all for being here and for listening to this. My older daughter, Orli Wildman Halpern, was 14 when she died after a college career in cancer care. That is nearly 4 years of care, during which my family became experts in a peculiar corner of hepatology and oncology. Orli's cancer career included, but was not limited to, 2 full springs of chemotherapy, a full liver transplant, a myriad of other surgeries, from biopsies to painful lung resections, to 2 craniotomies to remove metastases to her brain, 2, an obscene number. In between, there was radiation and, of course, a pandemic. But Orli, as she would often tell us, was not her disease, and she was definitely not her death. So I want to take a few minutes to tell you about Orli in life. It is, after all, a very strange thing to tell only a story that narrates the worst of her experience. Orli was insouciant. She insisted on living every moment, on seeing beauty and running toward it, on living beyond herself and trying to soak up every minute as though she knew, and perhaps she did, that she would not live out the fullness of the years once promised her. Orli loved adventure parks and surfing, dance, and reading. She won a lead in her school play after 2 brain tumors and 2 craniotomies. It was 12th night. She once watched every single Marvel movie back to back to back to catch herself up on all the films. When she put her mind to something, she didn't back away from it until she had absorbed it fully. Halfway through my pregnancy with Orli, I left for a 3-month fellowship in Germany. We grew there navigating German OB/GYN appointments and pharmacies, pregnancy yoga, and Holocaust research. I stayed in a section of Berlin filled with pregnant women, and all around me, people celebrated my girth. When asked, sometimes I said I was growing a little Jew. Mostly we called her Snow Pea, long before we knew we'd name her Orli, my light, Chaim, life, for my grandfather. Orli understood self-care and makeup and fashion. She loved dystopian fiction and horror films, skiing and speed. She made every nurse tell her their worst stories. Orli wasn't fearless. She engaged with fear. She spoke to it, got under it, wanted to understand it, didn't run from it. She insisted we sit with it and not lie to her about it. She was one of the most authentic people I've ever met, and she insisted on the same authenticity in everyone around her. She had an innate sense of design and order that made her loathe her messy family spaces. In the last months of her life, she lost the ability to walk, and still she would direct friends and family for hours to create minute changes to her room because she had precise vision. She kept running lists of books she'd read and books she wanted to read and would engage nurses on authors. She wrote novellas. She was a great actor and loved the theater and had a Talmudic intensity about Harry Potter. Orli hated bystanderism. She was a great friend and often a great sister. She was deeply political, an activist, and she had an innate sense of justice. Orli knew she was both more mature than her peers and also missing out on all the things that make childhood a childhood and allow one to mature to maturity. Once she told me life had ended for her when cancer began, but it wasn't really true. She lived each moment hugely. She just was no longer living a life within her own choosing. She came to loathe the filter of forced pity that came with being a pediatric cancer patient. She lamented often toxic positivity. She requested they play Taylor Swift and Lizzo in operating rooms. She made nearly every provider dance with her at least once. Orli asked questions. She demanded answers, and some of her questions were impossible. What, she asked me once before she died, did I do to deserve this? She was aware. Orli loved high ropes adventure courses and to feel feel fear that was of her own choosing. She loved friends and school drama and didn't mind biking alone. She would invite everyone she met to Shabbat dinner. In late spring, just before the chaos of Orli's first brain tumor, we had one perfect week. We got to be extras on a television show, but she escaped all the extras and sat with the directors, sure that her presence was wanted among the stars. She wasn't wrong. Later that weekend, we ran around Manhattan alone, walking 50 blocks, eating late-night ramen. I never wanted it to end. Orli hovered between adult and child and the understanding she was neither or both, due to the circumstances beyond her control, and she was tried more than any adult I've ever met. She bent the parameters of childhood even as she clung to it. She defied expectations, surfing just 2 weeks after brain surgery, believing as much as anyone she could push past this disease and just be. Orli wanted honesty, and once I asked her what she'd learned from all this, she said, other people have a low pain tolerance. A year and change after she was first diagnosed with cancer care, she came on the New York Times Instagram Live page with me. I'm going to show you a few clips that we've spliced together from that interview because it shows you how much Orli understood, how joyful she was. She was 12 at the time.
Maybe you'll see a post about it or something, but that's like the parent or older person. It's never like the kid telling you their story. I think because I'm old enough to articulate what's going on for me, but I'm also still young, so I'm still going through child cancer, also going through my childhood still. And I think that's really unique because I'm also trying to just live out my life like a normal kid, but also battling with cancer at the same time.
What do you think you miss the most about regular life?
Well, doing all the stuff I could do before. Also having hair, not only because like it's nice to have hair, also because like everybody in the hall stares at me now, which is not always great. It depends. I don't know if I like always wanted to be in the spotlight. I don't know if I still like doing that, but now I've been put in this position. I might as well use it for better and to inspire people to keep dancing, keep fighting. Through the pandemic too, like everybody's going through a hard time.
You like asking people about crazy stories all the time too.
Yes. I think that makes me feel like better about myself, knowing that I'm not the first one and I'm not the last one, and I'm also not the one going through the worst year, but I'm also not the also makes me feel better helping other people throughout that too. So maybe a nurse eventually will share my story and help another person out, like them telling it's me, help me.
You wrote an essay last year about losing your hair and how you process dealing with that. And I know the doctors asked you to share that with some other kids. What do you think about that, trying to be a role model? What does that feel like for you?
I think it's crazy. Just like the more simple things. Like people older in my school coming down to me and be like, oh my God, you're such an inspiration.
A year after this video was taken, this is April 2021, my family flew to Florida for a long weekend. It was March of 2022. We had celebrated Orli's masked, tested, unbelievably joyous bat mitzvah 2 months prior. We were, by all appearances, healthy, but we were really at the end of a reprieve. In late February of that year, 2 new lung lesions had blighted her scans. We asked Orli's team if we should consider moving up her long COVID-delayed Make-A-Wish trip to Hawaii. Alternatively, could we postpone surgery till after her best friend's bat mitzvah? In other words, did a third relapse mean we should be considering not just how to treat, but how to live? But they balked. Instead, we elected once more to forestall life for treatment. A Miami weekend fit the surgeon's schedule. When we arrived at the beach, Orli ran to the waves, then came back and stretched out on a lounge chair. Then she turned to me. What if this is the best I ever feel again? She asked. 376 days later, 3 months after she turned 14, she died. In the time since she left us, I've often thought of Orli's question. All that spring, she would ask me pointedly, why did we think a cure was still possible? In her diaries, she wrote, increasingly, it looks like I will not survive this. It was clearly a conversation she wanted to have, and yet we found such conversations are often discouraged, both in the doctor's office and outside it. I now know that end-of-life care is delicate, but with a child, it's obscene. Fear of death, fear of failing patients, fear of hurting them emotionally, and fear of failure in the quest for a cure stalls important conversations. Years in cancer care had come with dozens of critical, terrifying moments, but each had been overcome. That the cancer would outwit us seemed impossible. In the last year of Orli's life, we needed a forcible shift in perspective to understand that our time with her, which once seemed immense and boundless, would be measured in days or months. We did not learn how bounded it was until it was too late. And when we reached that point, we found we were on our own in helping her and helping ourselves navigate the unnavigable. The absence we experienced continued well beyond the reach of Orli's life. Though multiple studies have shown families who lose a child, unsurprisingly, face mental and physical health problems, and that bereavement care is essential care, our primary hospital offered no bereavement services. There was little to fill in that gap. Unlike a child who loses a parent, we found that ultimately Jewish mourning practices also fail parents who lose a child. Beyond shloshim, there is nothing, no requirement, no kaddish must be said, no abnegation must be made. With rules created in antiquity when child death was too common, I can only assume that mourning as one does for a parent would have placed an undue burden on families. But now we stand lonely in the corner. We are somehow always and never an Avel, though the rules of Avelim do not apply. There are no rules. We have never seen a Jewish bereavement parent circle in this country. Even the larger moments of communal mourning seem to speak to more timely death. It is kever avot, after all, not kever banot or banim. And so in death we were adrift. At her bat mitzvah, Orli told the congregation she knew all too well what it meant to be alone, that no deity had shown up in her hospital room. That loneliness continued. And yet, when Orli was still with us, I began to research how things can be better, even as they were falling apart. I discovered care teams like our own are often unprepared to face that shift from curative to maintenance to end-of-life care. And emotional and psychological care can fail families at their most vulnerable. I began to wonder not only about death, because for a very long time I feared to think about death, but trauma. If we'd been asked to really consider that Orli's time on Earth was limited, how might we have better used that time? What would we have done with her, talked to her about, introduced to our own community? What are ways in which we could have asked people to be more present? At one time in her final months, I lamented, we didn't want another food train. What we needed was a friend train. Throughout Orli's illness, from diagnosis forward, and particularly in her final harrowing months, her physical pain, thank God, was largely addressed, but those efforts were undercut by an absence of emotional support for us, for her sister Hannah, and as for how to truly understand the expression of life-limiting illness, we were on our own. In late September of 2022, following a successful second brain surgery, Orli was hospitalized with severe headaches. This was after she'd won the lead in the play and joined the volleyball team. Her medical team was at first intent on getting her back to play rehearsals, back to school, but her pain didn't subside. As we tried ever more treatments, a palliative care doctor stopped by one day and lightly, gently, offered what she called a back door to home nursing, hospice. Under Obamacare, she explained, children can continue curative efforts concurrently with hospice, a prospect unavailable to adults. It turned out that in our case, hospice insurance benefits did not actually include general and home nursing. I was driving when a hospice intake nurse called Orli. I very confidently told her was going to be on this other kind of hospice, the kind that received supportive assistance, but also entering a drug trial. And I understood she was entitled to continued curative or life-extending care. The nurse said all that was true, but she added, you know they told me she has 6 months to live, right? No, I said, you're the first to tell me. After Orli was discharged, an oncologist stopped me to ask me about the stalled hospice onboarding. I told her the story, the nurse, the card, the prognosis, and asked, is it true? Does she have 6 months? And she looked at me and said, that's an antiquated way of thinking about hospice. I think if I'm honest with myself, she meant we cannot predict when death will occur. But she did not say that. She didn't say we've discussed there's no cure, Orli will not survive. Nor did she say the idea of hospice may inspire panic, as it did. But studies have shown it can actually extend life. I have told the story many times to my sister, who is a nurse practitioner in oncology, and each time she asks, if the doctor had said bluntly, Sarah, she's dying, would I have been able to hear her? And I have said, honestly, I don't know, maybe not, but that's not the conversation we had. You might say this story sounds ridiculous, even willfully ignorant. It was hospice. Shouldn't I have understood that meant she was dying? But consider, I had been assured that for children, hospice is no longer exclusively end-of-life care. And consider, just 2 weeks prior to that moment, what we saw was this. Orli had been surfing. Just before the hospitalization, we had gone to a Lizzo concert we could barely tear her out of. What were they seeing that we didn't see? What did they not say that they already knew? And consider the child we saw was the one you have seen in these videos. How did that square with this prognosis? Doctors know parents of critically ill children are endlessly searching to find a miracle, an untried drug, a new treatment, an expert with a plan. Hearing there is no cure is not the same as hearing she is dying, nor is the same as saying death is near. Many of us with terminally ill children need to be told our child is going to die over and over again to really believe it. But medical teams are typically reluctant to bridge that distance between reality and hope. For a child like Orli who seemed unbeatable, we were all reluctant to face reality. Facing the limits of medicine's ability to cure forces medical teams and caregivers to hover in a space between hope and acceptance, love and terror. It's also where communications falters. How to live well, especially when facing death, requires knowledge. It means choices can be made when we know time is limited. We were close with our rabbinical team. We saw them often. Orli attended a Jewish school, but no one had a roadmap for this. We did call hospice back 2 weeks after that 6 months to live conversation. Orli's oxygen levels had dipped and we needed assistance. But a baton was dropped in the transition of sharing care between hospital teams to hospice. The well-meaning people we met from hospice seemed to know little about Orli and were not prepared to understand where we stood. It was not clear how long she might continue to live on, trying experimental treatments. We asked them how to face this traumatic intermediary period of knowing death would come, but not when, and they sent me materials on grief and bereavement. I reminded them she's not dead. We are in a traumatic intermediary space. How do we handle this? What should we do where we are? We were not at acceptance. I'm not sure entirely we ever were. Even at the clinic, among those who knew us best, we fell through gaps in caregiving. Orli's favorite child life specialist left the hospital in that late fall, and by New Year's Eve had been long gone. That night of New Year's Eve, as 2022 turned to 2023, Orli had 2 massive seizures. When we called the hospice on call, they offered very little advice. We were entirely on our own. For days, once she reached the hospital, infectious disease experts searched for the right antibiotic cocktail. She had a terrible, terrible infection caused by her PICC line. When Orli moved from intensive care to the oncology floor, I went to see child life specialists at the hospital who she knew and who, more importantly, knew her. Her perspicacity and her wit, her droll cynicism. I wanted someone we trusted to help us face where we were now, maybe even to consider death. It couldn't be in someone entirely new. But I was dissuaded from consulting anyone beyond oncology. One child life specialist we had worked with said she was explicitly advised not to speak with us. We were assigned a new hire, a chipper young woman who didn't know Orli, and Orli didn't know. She brought with her an attitude and a tone calibrated to a different type of child. Orli rejected her, and she disappeared. After Orli died, I wrote to the hospital ombudsman asking why child life had not shown up for her in a meaningful way. I offered to come in to talk about the delicate emotional needs at end of life. Nothing ever came of it. While we were in the hospital, a tumor compressed Orli's spine and took away her ability to walk. A group of doctors from rehabilitation came in one day to talk to us. They offered her a multi-week inpatient stay. And I turned to our oncologist later that day and I asked, but I don't understand. How much time do we have? And they said, we're so glad you asked. So I was left to wonder why it had been I that had to broach this. This is a lot of negative, but there are hospitals doing this well. I first reached out to neuro-oncologist and pediatric palliative care specialist, Dr. Justin Baker, then at St. Jude's when Orli returned from that last hospital stay. He advocates an integrated interdisciplinary approach to palliative and end-of-life care for children that pulls in bereaved families as teachers. The work doesn't end when a child dies. The program was created with the assistance of bereaved parents. Now a committee mentors families going through transitions in care as well as newly bereaved families. It matches bereaved parents with doctors, teaching them how to give hard news. 4 months before Orli's death, Orli texted a friend. I'm going to die, she wrote, but doesn't everyone? I'll just die a little sooner than most. This is a great opportunity for me, actually. Everyone's so focused on the time they have left. They forgot to live. That she could face what we were not was not unusual. There is a push among some psychologists to allow teens and young adults a role in determining not only the course of their care, but also how they live their days and how they died. What if we had had caregivers or spiritual assistants in facing that moment? I know options for legacy making exist. Some hospitals and hospice offer older children and adolescents the chance to write their family members' future letters, to record memories, even press handprints into clay, to sit with everyone as they process life, just as we might for a person dying at an age that feels more appropriate. But physicians and nurses, psychologists, and caseworkers often distance themselves from the trauma in which they're immersed. I can't imagine what you're going through, one of the palliative care doctors said to me during our last stint in intensive care. It seemed to me such a bizarre statement. What is your job, I wondered, other than to imagine this pain? Every study I have read on this subject has found that the only way to mitigate the terrible comorbidities associated with losing a child is with therapeutic intervention with a family in the time before a child's death, and then early, consistent grief work after. Support for a child and her family, including posing and then facing questions about end of life and how to live when life is suddenly bounded, can help a family better face life after a child dies. But investment in this area continuously falls short. In March 2024, a paper in The Lancet underscored how bereavement care is not a luxury, but a public health necessity. Such care, however, remains far from universal. The result is that during critical illnesses, families become dependent on a war room of professionals caring for their sick child, only to find themselves feeling abandoned after that child dies. I kept coming back to something Wendy Lichtenthal, a lead author on the Lancet paper, told me. Our culture has a profound lack of grief literacy. Medical teams may fear death for children, but so does society, in a cycle of evasion and suppression that ultimately fails us all. It's why so many of us feel so alone when death and grief come, no matter the age. After she died, I found that Orli had worried most about what would happen to us, Hannah, Ian, and me, if she were to leave. I offered her no reassurance. I didn't know these were her fears. I learned of them too late. She and Ian spoke about death more than I did. What happens? Where do we go? Is there something more? Will we ever see each other again? I wish I'd been in those conversations. Still, I'm comforted they took place. Everyone, even children, deserves the opportunity to sit with these questions at the end of life. I do have like a short clip from her bat mitzvah we can play really quickly and then go to our Q&A.
If God was around the Israelites all the time in a cloud, what was happening to the rest of the world? It's not fair to give all the attention to the Jews. If you know me at all, you know I'm obsessed with Harry Potter. And in Harry Potter, the headmaster of Hogwarts, Albus Dumbledore, is biased against the Slytherins, just as God is against those who aren't Israelites. God's love for the Israelites is here to the exclusion of God's love towards everyone else, just like Dumbledore's love for Harry manifests to the exclusion of other students. Anyways, some people can answer my question in many different ways. For instance, you could give the argument that it was not all of God, for God is supposedly an all great and powerful being. It could be multiple places at any different time. But my problem is that either way, he was always there for the Israelites. It wasn't like he was backing anyone else like this. And as a Jew, of course, I'm grateful that he was presumably there, but I shockingly, I know, empathize with the other cultures who did feel like God was with them. I can sort of understand what it's like to feel like the universe is against you. I had freaking cancer, and God didn't just waltz into my hospital room saying, "Sup, Orli?" And I'm sure we can all relate to the frustrations COVID has brought us. There isn't someone waving a magic wand to get us out the hole humanity has dug for itself because people can't wear a mask. By the way, don't forget to get vaccinated. Kids are eligible now. Anyhow, getting a little carried away there, as I was saying, we can all relate to the feelings of despair, helplessness, hopelessness, depression, and other big words that describe overall sadness. We all thought that COVID was getting better, so we started socializing, well, some of us, going to parties, having sleepovers, coming out of our shells, trying so hard to remember the person who just texted you out of nowhere saying, "Haven't seen you in so long, let's hang out soon." But now we're told germs named after Greek alphabet letters are here and going to get us sick. So we had to retreat back into our shells that we fought so hard to come out of, go back to testing relatives, eating outdoors, and wearing masks, back to the new normal that we had to get so accustomed to. God might not be there to hold out a hand and help you through it. I actually resonate with the Egyptians who felt like God was not close to them and they were alone. Don't get me wrong, they were mean, but I do understand what it's like to feel alone. But God doesn't need to be the thing that helps you out. You can do that for yourself, surrounding yourself with the people who care about you, doing the things you love with the people you love, as totally corny as that sounds. I myself read Harry Potter and rant to my friend Dinknesh about Harry Potter and watch Harry Potter. Okay, you get the idea. You also probably watched the cringy but fun TikTok videos I did during chemo cycles. They didn't help me stay positive. That was an impossible goal, but they did help me feel connected to my friends.
Great. Thank you so much. We're going to cut the beautiful words in the chat of gratitude to you and share them all with you after. Gabby, all yours.
Thank you, Sarah. I've loved hearing about Orli today and before today. The Swiftie, the surfer, the lover of Harry Potter and other people's horror stories, the hater of toxic positivity and bystanderism. And I just probably speak for a lot of people here by saying thank you for sharing her story and your family's story today here and before today. So we'll launch in with the first question. A few minutes ago, you said that Orli wasn't fearless, but that she engaged with fear. And I think one reason we're so bad at supporting people who are dying or people who are grieving is a failure to engage with fear. People want to say, like, I think it was the oncologist you mentioned, "I can't imagine," instead of trying to imagine what it would be like if it were them or their child. I wanted to ask you, what are the consequences of this kind of fear avoidance?
I often think, and I think you and I've discussed this before, that it's not so much that people can't imagine whenever they say that, it's that they don't want to imagine, right? They don't want to picture themselves in that space. And certainly in the case of a child, which is you fill in the cliche, every parent's worst nightmare, which is true. It is actually something we're all very, very terrified of. I think from the moment you let a child run around a playground by him or herself or themselves, you worry something will happen. They'll fall from the slide. Something will happen anytime but there's a reason why we do that. So we do anticipate and fear something bad happening to them. I think what happens is it's what Rabbi Shai-Held calls the distance between empathy and pity. He discusses in his book, which is about the sort of condescension that comes and the distancing that comes from pity. My mom had breast cancer when I was a child, and she used to call it Rahmanis eyes. So like pity, but in Yiddish, it has a more evocative word to me, that she would run into people in the supermarket and they would give her Rahmanis eyes. But in a strange way, it was a little bit like, oh, thank God it's you and not me, right? It also creates this sense that it is not possible to happen to people. I think there's two pieces to it. One is that people are very uncomfortable with things they can't make better. And so that terrifies them, that they have to just sit and witness it and be present, even though they can't fix the situation. They're not going to bring Orli back. I mean, I know that Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg talks about resurrection, and, who knows? But I think that for most of us, the thing that we would most want, we can't have. And people are uncomfortable with that. But it mostly comes down to something that Rabbi Sharon Brous has written about as well, which was there's this midrash she talks about in her book, and she's spoken about on stage and otherwise, which was that in the time of the pilgrimage holidays and the time of the temple, supposedly people would come to the Temple Mount and walk in one direction or another. And those who walked in one direction had something bad happen to them that year, and those who walked in the other had a decent year or a non-eventful year would walk, and they would have to face each other. And the person who had a non-eventful year would have to say to the person who had a terrible year or a loss or a breakup, malach or malacha, why you? Like, what happened to you? And face the fact that at some point we're always going to be in one of those circles, right? That we don't escape the tragedy that is life, that humanity is limited. We're all finite in some way. And so I think that the limits of all of this, I don't know if this is a really long-winded way of answering your question, the limits of all this mean that we sort of imagine ourselves so outside of this experience that when it comes to our time to having this experience in one way or another, we find ourselves alone and without a guide.
Yeah, that idea of wanting to distance ourselves and wanting to, I think the most painful thing I've learned over the years is like one of the worst things you can say to someone is, this is why because they want to see themselves as different. This is why I, have an alarm system or lock the door, or do this health-wise or that health-wise. Because they want to create that distance instead of understanding just sort of the chaos that we all live in, and that really we don't, as you said, we don't want to imagine, but we really all can. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I like that expression a lot, Rahmanis eyes, because anyone who's experienced grief knows that, like, and in that is, as you said, I'm so glad it happened to someone else and not, I'm so glad it's not me. So the next question I asked is something that we were talking about as we were preparing for this convening, just like stopped me in my tracks. And it just made me think about how I talk about grief, because I've talked a lot about meaning making over the years. But you said that you hate the whole idea that we're supposed to make meaning out of grief, that you find it almost offensive as someone who's lost a child. Why is this cultural imperative to turn something terrible, like full stop terrible, into something meaningful so problematic?
I mean, first of all, I will preface this by saying if meaning making works for someone, mazal, like, wonderful. I'm so glad it does, right? I don't want to take that away from someone who feels that gives them some space. It does not work for me, and it doesn't work for a handful of other bereaved parents I've sort of talked about this with. I don't think there's a greater meaning in Orli's loss. I don't think there's a better place for her to be anywhere than with me. I'd rather her be here with me, now 16, arguing with me. possibly wearing clothes I disagree with. I don't know. I think that there isn't a greater gift than her getting to live out the, length of her days and outlive me. That would have given me greater meaning. And I really struggle with the idea of trying to give any kind of triumphant arc to the story. You and I have talked about this a bit too, which is that the American ethos of sort of triumphalism is such that people really struggled with a story that wasn't going to end well. And I think it kind of speaks to your other question too, which is like at the beginning, it was like, oh, Orli will have such a great college essay. Wow. She's just going to be so strong. And, think of this amazing thing your family has triumphed over. And people really struggled with the idea that life is chaotic and that we can't control it. And that there might be not a happy ending to it. So for me, the meaning making is really, really hard. And I have to sort of leverage it into legacy making as opposed to meaning making, right? I think to me that gives more, which is to say, what is Orli's legacy? How can I impart Orli's story? How can I give her extended life in terms of talking about her ethos? I always say it shouldn't matter. She was remarkable, but she was remarkable, but I think that telling her story, keeping her alive in some way in terms of memory, for me, I guess allows me to continue to parent her, but it also allows me to give a sense of understanding to the experience. I still will never understand it. I still will never understand why this happened, and I don't think there's a meaning to it. It's more of learning to assimilate her loss into my life, and understand what that means and how to live on without drowning in that, because I think that's the hardest thing about grief.
Yeah, I just wrote that down, that kind of shift from like talking about meaning making to talking about legacy making, and that enables you, it sounds like, to maintain, to still parent, because the relationship doesn't end when someone dies. Orli spent, as you put it just a few minutes ago, the length of a college career in cancer care. And everyone liked to talk about, oh, she's going to have such a great college essay. Like that speaks to the whole triumphalism of our society. But that was the length of her treatment. And how did you, during that time, experience support from friends and family? Especially as she got sicker over time, and it extended not just months, but into years.
So at the very beginning, as I said, I felt like there was enormous rallying effort, obviously meal trains, lots of assistance. And then, her illness extended on. And there were two things that happened. One was that it went on and on and on, and then there were setback after setback. But also we entered a pandemic, and people's elasticity and their ability to sort of extend themselves shortened. There was a lot of fear. There was a lot of sense of their own vulnerability. It became much, much harder for people to extend themselves further. And then I think the other thing that happened was people got used to us being in a cycle of health and unhealth and lack of health, and sort of because also she presented so phenomenally well, and she would sort of come and go from school. We had asked at some point, we didn't want any more meal trains. At some point, I would sometimes say I could use ingredients, but the girls wanted me to cook. They didn't really want endless meals. And it can be very difficult to always be the recipient of tzedakah in that way, of charity, right? You can feel a little like you're treading water, right? And so I think what ended up happening was we fell out of people's lives. It became really easy not to see us anymore, both because everyone was home and because they got so used to it in some way or another, if that makes sense. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying, and I'm not quite sure. I think our sense of wanting to be self-sufficient also played a role in that. We had a very hard time asking for what we wanted. And I think what I said at one point, and I I can't remember if I just said this just now or you and I have talked about this, but that, you know, we started to think we needed a friend train and not a meal train, right? We needed to sort of set up scheduled visits and sort of really push for that. So I think, and now I'm not sure if I've answered your question or not. I feel like I've made.
No, you did. But I'm curious why you think it's so much easier for someone to offer to give a meal, to show up with a meal, to send a meal, than to actually, like, I love this idea of friend trains. And you've just brought up so much today that I feel like we can take from here, this idea of legacy making, the idea of friend trains instead of food trains. But so why is it so much harder to like actually show up for someone? Um, you know, why is a friend train so much of a bigger ask for people than actually, sending meal after meal?
I mean, isn't it sort of like the pyramid of tzedakah in some ways, right? I mean, in some respects, it is not nothing to create a meal. I don't want to dismiss that at all. And obviously there was a certain point, especially at the beginning when we were super bewildered and we lived at the hospital and everything was insane, that it was a lifesaver. I think that to commit the time, people think it needs to be some huge amount of time. It really didn't. I think that was one thing that we tried to express to people towards, especially in the last months of her life. Stop by for 15 minutes or check in more than once. It can't do today, or today I'm not, it doesn't work for me, but to consistently check, even I almost think like setting yourself like a little note on your phone. You know, I haven't checked in with Sarah this week. I'm just going to send her a note. There was a woman who was my old roommate in Jerusalem, like from a million years ago, who doesn't live anywhere near me. And I would say once a week, she would send me a note that just said, I love you. Just want to tell you, I love you. That's it.
Right.
And actually it was huge, right? Because it felt like a consistent presence, even though she wasn't near. And I think it can be as basic as that, or it can be much bigger, which is, hey, I'm in your neighborhood. Can I stop by with a coffee? Like, or do you need anything? No. Can I stop by and say hi? No. Can I, and try again and just try again? I mean, I think that's the thing that is hard. But I think that people feel it has to be some big visit. It's going to be hours of their time, or maybe they're going to see something that makes them uncomfortable. You know, I don't know what it's going to look like. Maybe the room is filled with medical equipment. Maybe she doesn't look good. Maybe it's scary. And I think they're afraid of that too. And I mean, and again, I just want to say that I don't know that I was so good at this prior to this moment. I don't know that I'm even amazing at it now. But I would say that I think that trying to figure out, and even if it's something like, I don't think I can be in a house with someone that sick. I don't know if I can handle it. And knowing that about yourself, maybe it's phone call. Maybe it's phone call. Maybe it's, I can't get over there, but want to chat for a little bit while I cook or something like that. It's a lot more basic, I think. I think it requires a lot less. And yet I think the psychological hurdle is larger than we are willing to admit.
I think what Orli said really spoke to me in what your friend did by saying, I love you. She couldn't fix anything, but she reached out time after time, or every Shabbat, or I forget the timeline. But what Orli said was, it didn't make me feel better. It made me feel less alone. And I think that's really important to think about when we think about supporting people who are going through an illness, or who are dying, or who are grieving.
Really got a note from a woman across the country telling her that her videos, I mean, and she did a huge number of videos when her own child was diagnosed, just telling her how important it was to her for her kid, who's a daughter, to see a kid dancing with, a bald head and feeling joyful. And they started a small, kind of pen pal situation at one point, and they were nowhere near each other. So I think Orli saw it and she really tried to show up while she could.
What was your experience with, you talk about other parents and showing up and sort of like the hurdle and people feeling fear about what they're going to see. And I'm just curious about what your experience was with parents and children, Orli's peers. Um, and there was two stories that you mentioned when we were preparing for this, one from Shiva and one from her last weeks that really spoke to you. And I was wondering if you could share them here today.
Well, one thing is from her last week's, which was that well, we were sort of struggling with the fact that she'd been out of school and fallen out of touch with people. The middle school administrator and I discussed what it meant and how hard it was to stay on people's radars without asking for much, right? But at the same time, asking for what it seemed like was a lot. And she took it upon herself ultimately in the last 2 weeks of Orli's life to get permission slips signed and bring girls in her own car to visit Orli in our house. And she then afterwards kicked herself that she hadn't done so sooner, that she hadn't kind of created a system where she was having people consistently visit her each week, let's say. But of course, as I said in the talk, that there was no roadmap for this. It was sort of the first time anybody had thought about doing this. There was a family that came for Shabbat dinner towards the end of Orli's life, and Orli had been at the hospital all day the day they were the night they were coming. And so she came home and she fell asleep and she didn't wake up in time for dinner. And in the morning, she said, I thought this family was coming for Shabbat. And in fact, I mean, I actually mentioned this in the talk the other day. It was not a Jewish family, not that it matters, but in any case. And I said, yes, they did come, but we didn't want to wake you. You had such an arduous stay at the hospital. And she was really upset. I mean, we just didn't have a ton of visitors at that time. And I spoke to the dad in the morning. Ian and Hannah went to shul and I was home. And the dad, they did not live close. I mean, think about the distance between I don't know, Park Slope and Morningside Heights. I mean, there was as far as apart as you can live in our areas, And he said, we're coming back. And I was like, well, no, I know it's a schlep. And, and he said, nope, we're coming back. And so he put his kid in the car, who was a year older than Orli, drove back to us, got to my house, insisted on making me breakfast, even though I was going to make eggs or something, and made the girls pasta. And they watched Survivor. It was not like a deep, chat. But after Orli died, I saw the family. We went on a walk, and I said, "How are you holding up? Like, how is your daughter doing?" I was worrying about the kid a bit, and they said, "She's so glad she came back. She's just so glad she got to see her." And I felt like that really speaks to something that we protect kids a lot, and we don't anticipate that they might carry regret for not getting to return, for not getting to have that meeting, for not getting to be present. Remember, these were 13, 14, and this girl, I think maybe almost 15. They weren't littles. Like these were adolescents, and they were, smart kids who were able to know you don't always get a second chance. And I think that was one thing that we kept thinking about, was that we all live like this. We all live thinking, well, I can't do lunch this week, but maybe next week. Actually, I'm so sorry. Next week I'm in New York. Do you think we could do it in 3 weeks? Actually, after Thanksgiving. We put a lot off. That's sort of how we live. But actually, none of us are promised anything. And then certainly if someone is facing an illness, being able to be there for them when they're having a good moment, even if it's for 15 minutes, and being present actually gives you something too. It doesn't only give the person something. You actually sort of both are experiencing a sort of mitzvah of some kind. And I think that you're giving yourself a future gift of recognizing you got to have another conversation, because you don't get a redo.
Yeah, it's not just the person who's sick or the family of the person who's sick who loses out. It's also the people who showed up or don't, or who don't show up in that moment. And this whole idea of we want to protect kids from what they'll see or what they'll experience. It's like you're not really protecting them, is what I'm hearing, is that this child, this 15-year-old, was so happy that she came back, was so happy they made that Morningside Heights to Park Slope, drive, and just showed up in the moment and it came back even when it was, wasn't super convenient, but just wanted to be there and show up, and just such an important lesson. And something you remember because it spoke to you, and I'm sure it's something that that family and that child will remember as well. So I guess, is there anything else you want to add before we go on to the next part of the agenda here today. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to.
I noticed somebody asked about spirituality and relationship to God, which I think is like, it's complicated in our family. I mean, obviously we've really, I think anger with God is very Jewish. It's a very classic Jewish space to be in, to be sort of in some sort of wrestling with God in some way or another. And yet Orli, towards the end of her life, actually wrote to somebody saying, why isn't anybody talking about a miracle? I do think that I think that it is one thing that I did actually want to say, though, is that there were malachim in my life, I would say, angels in some respects, some Jewish, some not, people who really came towards me in ways that they didn't have to. And one was a woman who I often think of as this incredible gift that came out of all of this in a strange way, which was that she and I were very close the summer that I was living in Germany while I was pregnant with Orly. And so she, was there much more than Ian was. He wasn't able to be in Germany that summer. And then as people do, like she moved across the country, we more or less lost touch. And then in the summer of 2021, she reached out and said, we've moved back to Maine, which is where she'd grown up, and offered us respite in Maine. And we were very worried because we were still very locked down. And they said, no, there's all this extra space. There's all this land, and there was a whole house, which was amazing and insane. But nevertheless, we ended up becoming very, very close with her and her children. And she sort of prepared her children. Actually, Orly was amazing that summer. She had no evidence of disease, but it gave Orly this incredible couple of weeks of autonomy that she hadn't had due to pandemic and cancer, where she could just be on a bike and bicycle everywhere. But they just had their fourth child, and they named her, the second name they named after Orly. They used this variation. But she's consistently shown up again and again, and will text things like she's decided that she sees Orly in rainbows. And I just think that yes, this has been a lot about how people didn't show up, but there were people who didn't have to. And my friendship with her has really, really, really deepened, but she also fell in love with Orly, as everybody, as you can imagine from seeing these videos, everyone who met Orly kind of fell in love with Orly. And I think that there were people who went out of their way to say, yeah, this scares me. This seems awful, but I'm going to be there and I'm not going anywhere. And I think I'll add one more thing, which is actually you and I discussed in the run up to it, which was a friend of mine in Vienna from a different time that I was working abroad. And I saw her the summer after Orly died, just maybe 2 months later. She was just wringing her hands over saying, I wasn't there for you. I wasn't there for you. And I said, it's the whole rest of my life. You can be here now. This doesn't go anywhere. This process is not short. And I think that's one thing that perhaps I also want to leave, which is that clergy are really overburdened, and people are very, very, very busy. But the need in grief, as you know well, doesn't end after year one, and it doesn't probably end ever. I mean, for parents, because you constantly see everybody else continuing on. And so it can be embarrassing to show up late. You can feel really like, oh God, I'm so late. How am I coming now? And maybe acknowledge it, or maybe just show up,
Yeah. Like, so be the angel. And if you haven't been the angel, be the angel now. Be the malachim. Is that the right word? Now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, why not? It doesn't go anywhere. The need isn't. And in fact, if anything, I think that as grief continues, it's lonelier because it's assumed that you've just sort of returned.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing Orly with us, for sharing Orly's story, for sharing those videos that I really appreciate you being here today. And I'm sure everyone on this Zoom does as well. And thank you just for being you and for sharing your story. Also, if you haven't read some of Sarah's work in the New York Times about Orly during her illness since she died, I highly recommend it. Just should be required reading for every human.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a little terrifying, not gonna lie. It's a lot of people here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much to all of you for listening.
Beautiful. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Gabby. And thank you all for the conversation that's been going on in the chat. We have more than 150 people here live with us, but we have more than 400 people who registered, knowing that we'll send them recorded bits from today. Sarah, it's really a gift that you give to the world by sharing Orli with us. And I know that you continue to do so in lots of different ways. And many of us are looking forward to your future writing. There was a question in the chat, asking about, how can we read more of what Orli wrote? You talked about her diaries, and I imagine that in the future we'll continue to hear her voice through you. So I just want to thank you for the work that it takes, the inner work that it takes for you to show up in the world in this way. And to Gabby for helping to deepen our experience with you here today. What can you do differently in your work or in your community based on what you heard? Right, thinking about what Sarah shared about her family's experience, the questions that Gabby asked Sarah, the conversation the two of them had, what are you thinking now about what you can do differently in your work, in your community, in your life based on what you heard? And I hope that as we see the cascade of answers showing up in the chat, that you will take others' suggestions to your own communities. I see being present for those who are grieving after the 30 days, right? There were certain obligations upon the mourners for after the death of someone who is not your parent for the first 30 days. But after that, Sarah pointed out, things kind of drop off in terms of Jewish ritual. And so how can we, as community members, as staff, as caring people, continue to show up in the absence of what Jewish ritual provides at other times? Good. So we are now going to talk a little bit about Sarah's experience in terms of it mirroring the stories you see in your day-to-day work and life. Our Jewish value of mutual responsibility invites us to show up for one another during life, right? Happy occasions, and certainly at death. This idea of arevut, of responsibility, some of you may be familiar with the phrase Kol Yisrael arevim ze bazeh, right? All of Israel is responsible one for another. This idea of particularism, that we take care of people in our immediate circles before we take care of people further out in an idea of concentric circles. We heard from Sarah about people who did and had trouble showing up in life when Orli was alive. And in death, that idea that she shared about, it's never too late. She's just going to continue to be a grieving mom for the rest of her life, right? And you may be embarrassed. I might be embarrassed showing up now after not having been there earlier. But that Sarah seems to be inviting us in, welcoming us to continue to show up and take care of and provide support for her as a grieving parent who will always be defined as a grieving parent. Are you more comfortable talking about death before or after death? Right? We heard Sarah talk about that teacher who had a realization after Orli died that she could have done before. Across our fields, and I know we're here from a lot of different places. Some of us work in Jewish communities, some of us volunteer in Jewish communities. Across our fields, we can do better talking about death Jewishly. I'm pretty sure that that's not a surprise to you. We can do better in talking about death Jewishly in our classrooms, in our synagogues, in our community settings. Before loss and after loss, Jewish wisdom can guide us how we care, how we teach, and how we lead. You have agency to change things, right? Each of us has the opportunity to do something different as a result of our encounter with Sarah today. Shomer Collective helps organizations and communities to bring this work to life. Whether for your organization or your team, for your clients or your community, we have a variety of offerings that can make it easier to talk about death Jewishly, both before and after. This can look like trainings, workshops, partnership consultations. There may come a time when your organization needs to expand the amazing things you're already doing, and we're here to be your partner. Across this field, incredible work is already happening. Chaplains, educators, doulas, rabbis, volunteers, many of you are already tending to one part of dying, grieving, and remembering. We help you to weave these threads together Jewishly, so your programs, your staff, your community can approach death and dying with the same intention and creativity you already bring to life and living. If one of these topics is of interest to you or inspires you, reach out to us, hello@shomercollective.org. I want to give you a preview of one of these offerings so that you can get an idea of how your community might benefit from one of the ways we can partner. So I'm going to introduce my colleague, Rebecca Missel, Shiva Circle consultant, to talk more about how Shomer Collective is helping communities to show up in the time after death.
Amazing. Thank you, Melanie. Hi, everybody. As Melanie said, my name is Rebecca Missel. I am a consultant here with Shomer Collective. I'm really glad I can be here with everybody today. As Melanie, talked about this idea of showing up, really Shiva Circle is deeply, deeply rooted in this idea of how we show up. And so we think about taking the work of organizing Shiva to a loving circle of support so that people feel held by our Jewish tradition and their communities, and we ensure nobody has to grieve alone. Shiva Circle is a project of Shomer Collective, and we are grateful to our sponsors and partners with the Steinhardt Foundation for Jewish Life, our other local and national funding partners, and we are actively seeking new partners. So if you're inspired by what you hear today, get in touch with us and we'd love to connect with you. So what is Shiva? Shiva is a noun. It is Hebrew for the word seven. And really, Shiva is such an incredible structure and guideline that gives us to understand how we show up for each other, right? So with Shiva, we mourners traditionally sit at home for 7 days while loved ones show up to care for their basic needs and offer comfort. During this week, we are obligated by Jewish tradition to show up for mourners, right? That's the mitzvah, that's the obligation of Shiva for those of us who are in that circle of support around the mourner, is showing up and just having our presence to be able to be there and sit together in community. Have you shown up for Shiva before? All right, I'm seeing an overwhelming number of yeses, a couple of no's, which I think also really important that we recognize that it's not a universal thing that we've all experienced, regardless of what our own backgrounds are. If a death happened this week, if somebody had a loss or a death this week, do you have the tools to support that community, to support that mourner? It's a mix, right? We're at not quite a 65-35 split, more or less, right? That if a death happened this week, a large, overwhelming majority say yes, and yet about a third of us still feel that that we could use more tools. So this is a perfect segue for us. There's a belief that Jews do death well, right? We see it in popular culture, that there's this idea of Shiva as this gift of care that comes from our extended friends, family, our neighbors, that mourners don't necessarily are not supposed to plan or host Shiva themselves. And the knowledge of how to organize and plan for Shiva, gets passed down from generation to generation. We go to a Shiva at some point in our lives and we see how people come together. And I like to think of it as this sort of light switch of support, that people who've grown up in the community or in a community where Shiva is observed know how that shift happens. And they say, okay, great. And people know how to spring into action. But that's not always the case, that people know how to spring into action, right? The reality for many of us is that Shiva can be really challenging to orchestrate, right? We live far away from our families. Our communities as adults may be formed outside of formal Jewish institutions. Maybe folks are less familiar with the rituals of Shiva. We grew up in, different faith traditions or with a blend of faith traditions. And we don't necessarily have that support network that knows how to just turn that light switch on of support. And so too often, and we heard this in a lot of our research that Shomer Collective conducted that informed the design of Shiva Circle, that people feel like they have to organize Shiva for themselves. They almost feel like they're hosting a dinner party or a cocktail party. Even Sarah said that, Orli Shiva felt like a cocktail party in hell, and where that's not necessarily what the intention is for this here, and that's not really what Shiva is supposed to be about. So here's how Shiva Circle helps. We offer resources, digital tools, and trainings to really help people reimagine how Shiva can work. So first off, we offer really accessible, informative resources that are designed to help family and friends and community members or clients in your organization, professional staff in your organization, understand how to show up. So the actions you can take as people here in this convening today is to pair our resources with the services you already provide. So that could be putting us on your website. And really, we hope that these resources are here for you to position your organization as a place people come for grief support, right? It's maybe not necessarily the case in your organization that people think of your school or a JCC in the way that they may another kind of an organization. And we're really inviting you into this opportunity to help people know that you are available as a resource. The next thing that we offer are digital tools, right? There's just as there's no one way to sit Shiva, right? We're seeing so many different versions of people's Shiva personal experiences of Shiva in the chat, right? There's no one way to sit Shiva, and there's no one way to organize the details. So what we offer, and another invitation for you, is to explore the digital tools on our website that are here to help you plan and organize Shiva, and to help get people involved with the creation and holding that space for Shiva. So we have a digital planning platform, we have some pre-made spreadsheets, and we have some digital and printable checklists as designed as a PDF. And then third of all is to invite us into your community. We're hosting an online individual training. Again, you can click in the QR code to get more information about that. And bring us to your community. We're available both online and in person to come to communities all over. And really, these trainings are designed to help with your community, your HESA committee, whatever it is, your group, to learn how to listen to mourners' needs, connect with the mourners' network, learn in a bit more detail about how to use the Shiva's digital tools and resources, and really learn how to connect people to additional support and options, right? Shomer is a collective, and we really think about the work in an interconnected way. And we know that no one organization can hold all of this on their own. So how can you make sure that people know, after Shiva is over, about, if there's a bereavement group available from your local Jewish family service or other resources that are in the community. So really, what are the next steps? So like we said, we are offering, if you're in Boston, you're in luck. We are coming in person to your community. We'll actually have our first info session for the Boston community next week on the 13th. And we'll be there in person on December 7th and 8th. So there's two options for ways to join an in-person Shiva Guide training. We are also offering an online version, thank you, Samantha, an online version of our training for folks that'll be offered in January. And again, we invite you to bring us to your community. We also invite you to include our resources on your website, and to make those available to the people who come into contact with your organization. And really what we hope for the 126 people who are here live now, and for the 200-ish more who will be watching this on replay, to be an ambassador for, we never know, Melanie, I have Melanie's voice in my head always thinking about this, right? Tomorrow is never guaranteed for any of us, and we never know when we might need help or when somebody we know and love might need help. And so we really invite you to, take the mantle of this conversation today and be an ambassador to talk with the people in your circles, personally and professionally, about Shiva and ways to, to bring that into the conversation. And of course, yes, please reach out to us. We're at hello@shivacircle.org. And we really look forward to hearing from all of you.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Rebecca. I want to invite all of you to think about how we can be helpful to you, right? We're here to help you do what it is you want to do and need to do in your community. What you see on the screen is just a sampling of some of the organizations we've worked with. Many of you are here today in the recent past. And so please reach out to us. We just shared the email address if you're interested in the Shiva project, hello@shivacircle.org. You can always reach us, hello@shomercollective.org for anything and everything as well. So I want to say a few words as we head into our conversation. This past summer, thanks to support from the Covenant Foundation, we had the opportunity to convene a small group of professionals. Some of you were there with us. We called it Grief Lab. A day-long, similar to this format, opportunity to learn with grief experts. In fact, one of you plugged earlier, one of the experts we met with this summer, Myra Sack, and her book, 57 Fridays, Losing Our Daughter, Finding Our Way, another excellent resource for your bookshelf. And during our Grief Lab, learning with Myra and others, we began to explore ways in which we might better address grief in our work. Think about all the griefs that we are carrying with us. We ourselves and are carried by those we serve. Anticipatory grief, right? We're expecting something. Traumatic grief, a bad thing has happened in the world and it has completely unmoored us. Complicated grief, it goes on for a long time. Post 9/11 grief, post October 7th grief, climate grief. Insert your own grief here. You can check out a link in the chat, which will be included in our follow-up email, to read a white paper we have just published and put on our website summarizing our research this past year about grief, Jewishly, and some recommendations. Huge thanks to our colleague, Dr. Gila Silverman, for authoring that white paper. And I also want to mention that Gila's mother, Phyllis Silverman, may she rest in peace, was mentioned earlier in the chat as one of the earlier writers about grief and children, and her books may be of help to you, those of you who work with children. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the future of grief, focused on new tools attending to grief. Psychologist Adam Grant, found this on his Substack, recently wrote that 72% of teens have used AI companions, and nearly a third find them as satisfying or more satisfying than human interaction. 72% of our teens, the majority of them, have used AI companions, and nearly a third of them find them as satisfying or more satisfying than human interaction. He suggests it's not hard to figure out why. AI chatbots have already surpassed the average human at offering empathy. Grant reminds us that critics have sounded the alarm about what can go wrong when AI chatbots shower teens with praise and validation. But the biggest problem with AI companions, Grant says, is that the interactions they manufacture are one-sided. So let's check in with you. Take a look at the poll popping up on your screen. Do you use artificial intelligence in your work? Maybe you use it in your work, maybe in your personal life, maybe in both places, or no, you don't use it at all yet, or at least you think you don't use it. The highest answers are both yes, both at work and in my personal life, and no, not at all. Okay, so we have people at both ends of the spectrum with smaller numbers of only at work or only in your personal life. And I want to share a bit from one of our colleagues in the field. Writing in E-Jewish Philanthropy earlier this year, Rabbi Josh Fixler, who had been profiled in a piece in the New York Times about clergy experimenting with AI in their sermons, suggests that we live in dehumanizing times, right? So here's a rabbi who's using AI in his work, and he suggests that we live in dehumanizing times. He writes, the gap between rich and poor grows ever wider. Basic human rights are up for debate and subject to political gamesmanship. To counter this problem of dehumanization, Rabbi Fixler suggests that Judaism is a rehumanizing project. The mitzvot, the commandments, our obligations, rehumanize us. They teach us that we're not just here to survive and consume, but that we're invited to live lives of meaning, purpose, and connection. And he says the Jewish calendar is a rehumanizing project. It offers opportunities to return to the same themes of the human story again and again. freedom and abundance, uncertainty and learning, tribulation and triumph. We revisit the same spots year after year to judge how far we've come, how much we've grown since we last read these words and performed these rites. Machines can learn, Rabbi Fixler writes, but humans can grow. And an AI cannot rest, nor can it pray. It cannot take pride in its growth. It cannot be inspired. It cannot be grateful. It cannot marvel at the miracle of creation or hope for a better tomorrow. We need not dig too deep into the wisdom of our tradition to be reminded of our humanity. We have it here on the screen. We humans are created in the divine image. What does this mean for us today? And how can we reimagine our lives in the face of AI to benefit from what makes us uniquely human? This is what drew us to our next speaker, an emerging voice in the space between AI and humanity, between computers and life. And now, Reverend Dr. Thomas Doyle joins the convening to explore how technology is reshaping grief and end-of-life care. As technology rapidly reshapes our world, it's also entering the most human of experiences: illness, dying, and grief. Dylan will share how AI is beginning to influence grief care, the possibilities it offers, the risks it poses, and what professionals and lay leaders should know to meet these challenges with wisdom and foresight. This keynote invites us to ask, how do we prepare for a future where AI becomes part of end of life and grief support? And how do we ensure it serves rather than harms the people in our care? Dylan, all yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Melanie, for that wonderful introduction. Today, we are talking about AI, which is such a term right now. There's so much that people are saying. There's so many different stories that we're telling. And we're going to get into some of that, but not all of that. I'll give my disclaimers momentarily. But first, who am I? So my name's Dylan. I am a Unitarian Universalist minister. In my ministry world, I got my Master's of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary, and I'm an APC board certified chaplain, or at least I was formerly before shifting my career. I did my chaplaincy residency at New York Presbyterian Hospital in New York, and I specialized in burn unit care and neuro ICU care. And I also did clinical pastoral education units at St. Luke's, Mount Sinai, and Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. So very New York based. But then I had this, we'll call it a crisis of faith, and I was trying to figure out what to do next. And so I made this wacky shift over to technology design. I got my PhD in information science from the University of Colorado Boulder, and much of the work that I did was around advanced care planning and trying to help hospice teams and hospitals figure out how to research and design interfaces. So electronic healthcare records, all of the thorny stuff that those of us in the healthcare world hit our head against over and over again to try to make better. I was trying to do that with advanced care planning across different teams. Currently, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Colorado Boulder. A lot of my work right now looks at AI and grief, which is why I'm here to talk about AI and grief. I'm also the research director at the Digital Legacy Clinic at the University of Colorado Boulder, which I'll get back to at the very end of this talk. But if you remember anything about my background and why I'm here, basically my work connects theology and spiritual care on one hand, and then technology design on the other hand. So as I was preparing for this talk, I was doing my minister thing, and I was trying to find some inspiration of how to ground this talk. And so I was reacquainted, going through my old notes, with a quote from one of my favorite theologians from seminary. Some of you might know him, Rabbi Abraham Heschel, and some of you might know this quote in particular, but I was really caught by it. Rabbi Heschel says, "Our goal should be to live life in radical amazement, to get up in the morning and look at the world in a way that takes nothing for granted. Everything is phenomenal. Everything is incredible. Never treat life casually. To be spiritual is to be amazed." And this is my provocation for us today. In this world where the hype of AI is increasingly influencing our congregations, our therapy offices, our hospices, and our hospitals, we even saw in some of the quotes earlier just some of the, well, AI is as good at empathy as humans. But for me, I'm asking, where is the line between amazement and hype, or amazement and harm in some cases? And where can this emerging technology be transformative to our grief care? Where is it simply just a useful tool for HR, for maybe managing payroll? And then where is it actually a threat to our grieving processes or our roles as caregivers or lay people supporting people at the end of life? I'm going to pull the minister card and say, I don't have answers for you, but I am going to help us nuance and ask some more nuanced questions around these topics so that we can continue the conversations both here and then also in our communities. So before I get to the grief stuff, here's a slide. It has lots of things about artificial intelligence on it, more on the technical side. When I do more technical presentations around this, I normally dive into the different interlocking circles here. But to give you a very brief definition, one that I like to use, artificial intelligence is the capability of computational systems to perform tasks typically associated with human intelligence. And a lot of what we're talking about today with grief is this last part, this little inner circle at the bottom there, generative AI. Generative and creative tools that you might have heard of large language models, but they basically just take lots of information, scrape lots of data from all over the internet, all of these different places, and create something with it, something that appears like it's something new. A lot of what we're talking about, like I said, in the space is about large language models, which again are essentially taking all of this data and making something new out of them. On your screen, some of you might be familiar with ChatGPT, is basically how ChatGPT works at a high level. You ask it a question, it combs through all of this data, all these little Excel documents, massive, in its background, and it creates something new out of it. It processes it, it does this whole weighting of probability. Again, we're not going to get too much into the weeds there, but it takes something, it does something, and then it spits out something on the other side. And AI can do a lot of things, as we'll talk about in a second. But what's important to note is that in many ways, it's really unspectacular. A lot of it is just very advanced analytics and statistical analysis. But one of the things that I'm interested in outside of just those analytics is that AI right now in our society is much more than the technical aspect itself. It's the stories that we tell about this technology. And there's this long history of science fiction and even ancient religious texts that play into those narratives. But the story that I want us to focus in on today is AI hype. As Emily Bender and Alex Hanna say in their new book, The AI Con, How to Fight Big Tech's Hype and Create the Future We Want, they say, to put it bluntly, AI is a marketing term. It doesn't refer to a coherent set of technologies. Instead, the phrase artificial intelligence is deployed when the people building or selling a particular set of technologies will profit from getting others to believe that their technology is able to do things that, in fact, intrinsically require human judgment, perception, or creativity. So the way that I think about this AI thing, including in grief support, is that the technical capability exists and is exciting, but the stories that we tell as a society, as religious communities, and then what we do with those stories matters even more. So too is the case with AI in grief, even for religious professionals. It's easy for us to fall into this hype trap. And I want to tell a very quick story. So as part of my research, I wanted to run an interview study with religious professionals, with chaplains, with folks who are on the ground with congregations, and I wanted to run this interview study. So I went on the social media groups that we usually do for recruitment for these studies, and I received a good amount of responses. Every single one of them was negative. I had people in my Facebook messages swearing me out for even proposing the study or proposing the question of the study. And one even accused me of supporting the stealing of their job. And this was pretty shocking to me, honestly, partially because I'm in this AI tech industry world at the same time. And I've continued to talk to clergy, to other colleagues, and there are many of us that are curious about this AI thing. But that response to my recruitment was really telling. And so I became curious myself, what are the stories that we're telling, that my colleagues are telling, that we're actually responding to? And how do we separate that hype from that fact? And then my theological question, where is the room for amazement in these periods of technological change? So let's get a little bit more grounded and think about some relevant things that AI is doing. And then we'll dive into grief support a little bit more specifically. So as was referenced a little bit in the quotes earlier, AI is transforming things like ministry and spirituality, in part by, let's say, helping clergy generate sermons or analyzing scripture in new ways. Congregations are using AI tools to prompt spiritual reflection and even ritual for their small groups. One thing that's interesting and has gotten a lot of press, but is still interesting, digital AI priests and pastors and rabbis are beginning to spring up all over the world, basically in that chat interface. And there's a particularly interesting theological conversation happening right now about the capabilities of an AI priest to lead communion or other sacraments. Questions around where is that line? Meanwhile, in medicine, AI analysts are assisting doctors in diagnosing diseases. AI-assisted robots as well are taking on a larger and larger role in patient care. I'd actually be curious, a lot of you have a lot more healthcare expertise than I do. I'd be curious if you've been seeing this out in the wild or not. AI is also reshaping how users are interfacing with food systems and even community meal sharing in religious settings. I know one Jewish colleague who used ChatGPT to brainstorm new recipes for their Seder this past year. And we're going to flag this one for now, the death one, but it is interesting as you look at this slide, and we'll come back a little bit in a second, some of the framing here of some of these platforms around death. So this one from the Ma Nana website, be the favorite grandkid dash forever. It's interesting, right? AI is also impacting basic home tasks, and very related to this talk, and again to the quotes from earlier, AI chatbots and voice companions now provide mental health support at scale, offering early intervention and emotional tracking between sessions. Therapists are using increasingly AI to detect patterns in speech and sentiment that they feel like they're missing. And AI agents are even being used to supplement grief therapy, such as this Wobot example that you see on your screen right now, which is public right now. You can go look it up. Meanwhile, AI companions, from virtual friends to robotic pets, are reshaping how people experience connection, comfort, and intimacy. Some of you might have seen the headlines around boyfriends and girlfriends and some of the challenges that adolescents are dealing with in terms of connection. We've also seen examples of deep bonds with these chatbots forming very negative outcomes, like encouraging people to self-harm. And these uses are raising big questions about the nature of relationships, attachment, and human bonds. So returning to the use case of death and grief support, let's go a little bit deeper. What are we talking about here? In our lab at the University of Colorado Boulder, we work with the technology that we have dubbed generative ghosts. And generative ghosts are basically AI agents, again, large language models, trained on the text, image, or voice of a deceased individual. You might also hear the terms dead bots and grief bots. Basically, what happened is that a few companies and academics all wanted to flag plant a little bit with their own terminology, but you can think about these all as the same kind of thing, of these representations of someone who is deceased that have been trained off of their data. And by trained, I basically mean that that data has been used as the building blocks for creating what that chatbot looks like. When I give talks about this topic, people inevitably bring up the topic of Black Mirror, if you all know the popular show. And in particular, people often reference an episode called Be Right Back, or BRB. And in this episode, after her boyfriend Ash dies, Martha uses a futuristic service that recreates him using his online data. Martha first interacts with the digital version and then with a lifelike Android copy. And though the replica sounds like Ash, for Martha, it feels emotionally empty. And so what Martha does is Martha confines it to her attic, which then remains in the dark forever. So it's a very worst case scenario. It's very dark and dystopian, but this is what comes to mind, I think, for many of us when we're thinking about these holograms, representation, generative ghosts. Outside of the sensationalist world of Black Mirror, to give an example, an illustrative idea of what's actually happening on the ground right now, here's some examples. You may have seen images or holograms of dead folks or services that claim you can speak to the dead. Here you have an example that got a lot of airtime in the public press, which reads, "A son's race to give his dying father artificial immortality." For months, he recorded his dying father's life story. Then he used it to recreate his dad as an AI. You're also seeing this technology being used for political action. Take this case, in which the voices of the victims of the Parkland school shooting were used to influence lawmakers for more stringent gun control legislation. And then there's entire industry springing up in China and increasingly in the United States, where families are looking for digital clones of their loved ones. And crucially, this technology is not that different from some of the cloning technology used by companies like Google and Microsoft, where some of the employees, in order for them not to go to meetings or be in meetings in multiple places at once, are essentially being cloned. So this technology, although we're talking about grief here, it's a little bit more pervasive in other contexts as well. And of course, therapists are beginning to use these agents for grief support in their practices. When I'm using the term AI agents, you can think of it as similar, the chatbot, basically that representation of a human. And some are arguing that generative ghosts can actually help their clients in the grief process. Interestingly, I think especially for this audience, where much of this technology was first being used within the Europe and the US context was in Holocaust memorials and museums, in which it was argued they could be used to help support cultural legacy and keep some of the stories continuing on long after folks had passed away. Now, in terms of ethics and impact, this topic obviously gets very complicated very, very quickly. But here is an example of an AI avatar of a Holocaust activist answering questions about her life at her own memorial service. Collectively, these technologies have joined a multi-million-dollar industry of what we call death tech companies trying to capitalize on the AI bubble. And even as we speak, multiple highly funded grief support startups are deploying even higher fidelity apps with avatars to be available for public consumption. Now, the problem is, as you might be thinking, there are no real legal guardrails or ethical best practices for these AI agents. Some groups in academia and industry like ours are trying to develop those, but right now, especially in the US, those legal ramifications, just they're not there, those recommendations. So that's where our ongoing research is coming in. In our work, we've begun to conduct simulated user studies with people actually using these generative ghosts to evaluate their experience and to determine some ethical guidelines. And when beginning this work, we were pretty skeptical. We had anticipated users to absolutely hate it. And we had expected them to experience what my good friend David Ryan Polgar calls existential ick around these generative ghost interfaces. But curiously, what we found, what our research actually showed, is that once people start using them, they typically describe their interactions as comforting or surprisingly helpful for them to process grief. And this was pretty surprising to us, that divide between what we expected, what even people expected in using these things, and then actually using them, that positive side of things. And in our early work with grief support therapists, we've heard similar hopes for benefits. With one therapist who specializes in traumatic loss, saying, I actually think using this technology as an intervention with some of my patients could be useful to their healing. It's almost like narrative therapy, or asking them to write a letter to their loved one. Flagging here that this is preliminary work. There's lots of nuance within this. And again, I look forward to hearing your perspectives on the nuance as well. But on my end, of course, for all the potential positives, ethical and psychological concerns abound. For example, I get concerned about the ways that prolonged interaction with a generative ghost could impede someone seeking or achieving closure and overdependence within that grief support and that grieving journey, those stages of grief. I also get very concerned about consent for data donation to build these interfaces, these generative ghosts, because after all, after you die, you don't really get a choice in how your data is used, broadly speaking. And US law has very little regulation about that. One of my biggest concerns is the tendency of pretty much all AI models to embrace sycophancy. That is, LLMs are really people-pleasy. Like if you've ever chatted with ChatGPT, you know yourself that it will always tell you exactly what you want to hear or what it thinks you want to hear. It's one of the reasons why AI girlfriends, boyfriends, partners can be so dangerous. Their praise can become addictive. And so what happens when it's the likeness of a dead loved one who is trying to just tell you what you want to hear? Another concern that I wanted to bring up for those of you in provider roles might be thinking about whether your jobs will be replaced or impacted by this new technology. This is a story that is everywhere. I'm not a labor expert at all, but I can tell you what I'm seeing. So I'm going to speak pretty bluntly from what I'm seeing. On the technology side, no. As we've discussed, you're doing very human work, and the technology just isn't there, and in my argument as a minister and a care provider, isn't going to be there more so than being a helpful support for the work that we do. However, on the business side and the capitalism side, I suppose, many companies like hospitals are using AI investment as an excuse to cut staff, and often staff like chaplains are some of the first to go. But my recommendation for us in this community is that as you're thinking about AI replacing jobs, don't villainize the potential of the technology so much, but instead think broader and take issue with some of the folks who might be using that AI and the story of AI as a potential smokescreen. But again, I'm not an expert here. This is just something that I wanted to mention my perspectives on, maybe as a provocation as well. So let us reset here. Maybe take a breath. I've been moving a mile a minute. But notice a little bit about what you're feeling about where we've been in this talk so far. Maybe you're feeling bored. I won't be offended. But maybe you're feeling anxious. Maybe you're feeling hopeful. Maybe you're feeling excited. But I do invite you, wherever you are, to recenter amazement. What does amazement look like for you in this emerging area? Can we carve out even an inch of amazement within a space where I imagine a lot of us still hold quite a bit of skepticism? And then what can we learn about ourselves and our own theology of change by paying attention to that resistance? The quick takeaways here: don't fall for the AI hype. Most of what you're hearing is some level of advertising, especially as we're in an AI bubble. However, the grief support tools are changing, and they're here whether we like them or not. And for those of us who give care, honestly, it's almost up to us about how big of a role these tools are going to play going forward. And at best, in my mind, these tools offer us a window to think about life and death in new ways. And again, on the biggest picture side, ask us questions. What is our theology of amazement? And what is our theology of change? While we not only have these technologies evolving, but also our stories around these technologies evolving. As I move towards closing, because we've been talking pretty high level here, I wanted to leave you with a more grounded note with a resource that is a bit more actionable in the area of digital legacy. This is a slight shift away from AI. But some of you might have even cared for people, or yourself have noticed there's so many data and accounts that we have when we pass away. I know when I've been caring for someone who is about to die, and then on the other side, when they have died, sometimes I've been left with just all of these social media accounts and photos and things I know are meaningful, but I don't know entirely what to do with them. And we noticed that at CU Boulder. And so we decided to make what we call the Digital Legacy Clinic. And basically, the Digital Legacy Clinic is a free, remote, mostly student-led service that provides two main services. One is helping people plan for their data and accounts, essentially what you would do in a will, but for some of those more squishy accounts, not necessarily the financial, but what do you do with social media? What even are your options as you're doing that end of life planning? And then two, for folks who have had a loved one pass away and they've been given all of these online pieces of data and accounts, trying to navigate what their options are and what to do with it. You can think about it like a pro bono legal clinic. So anyone from the US can submit a ticket. It's like a help desk ticket, and they'll receive personalized support. I am past time, but I did want to leave this up here so that you all can connect with us if you or people you know would like support in managing either their end-of-life planning for their data and accounts, or if folks who are trying to navigate all of that management of people's data and accounts. We are here. Please tell folks. And then if you would like to connect with me on any of these topics that we've covered today, please feel free to reach out. LinkedIn is generally the best place to reach me, which is unfortunate in some ways because I have thoughts on LinkedIn, but please do reach out. I'm sure you can also get a hold of my email as well. With that, I would love to open up for discussion.
Super. Thank you so much, Dylan, for your presentation and for the generous offer that we can be in touch with the clinic to figure out our digital legacies. There was a little bit of discussion in the chat from a religious professional whose spouse is a professional at a Holocaust museum. And I know you and I talked about this a little bit in the prep. I also think about it a lot personally. My in-laws were Holocaust survivors. My father-in-law recorded 6 hours of testimony during the Spielberg Shoah testimony collection days, on VHS 100 years ago. He has been dead for more than 20 years. We bring his stories to life by telling them, but I wonder about the creepiness or ethical questions in taking his testimony, his writings, recordings of his speeches, and creating a hologram figure for my kids to interact with their Zaidi, their grandfather in Yiddish, for the purposes of Holocaust education. Can you talk a little bit about this issue in particular?
Yeah, I think the creepiness part is real. Again, I really like this term of existential ick there. As I have been doing this research as a technologist, I put on my, oh, this is really cool. We can do a lot of things here. When I think about all of my hours talking to people at the end of life, I think about how much the family wanted to just let go and want to remember in their own words what that person's legacy was, or maybe in their writing. But I do think it becomes creepy, but also potentially problematic or psychologically harmful when it's that extending of that relationship. Especially, I think about this in terms of traumatic grief, and I'm not sure if the Holocaust example fits this perfectly, but the retelling of that kind of collective traumatic grief is so important that we're intentional about how we're doing that, and the stories that we're telling, the stories that we're not telling, I think that the intentionality there is really important. But I'll also say that the creepy factor, because grief is so personal and so different for each of us, that makes it really difficult to figure out, well, what is appropriate, what is not appropriate, what tools should be available, what are unethical there.
Thank you. A question from Rabbi Fred Klein in Miami. How does AI reinforce our alienation? AI is one-sided and made to address all the emotions, humans will always be human and therefore disappoint. Alienation.
Just looking at the question real quick.
I'm thinking about like the teens who are having some emotional need met, but it's not a real relationship for all its positives and negatives.
Yeah, well, again, so I want to see AI not as its own thing that's separate from all these other things that are happening in the government and society for teenagers. I think the alienation that we're seeing, AI provides a tool or a capacity to do that more. I think the thing that makes AI different than some of the other technologies out there, like just social media that already were spurning on massive amounts of alienation, particularly in young men in the US, but also in general, is that sycophancy that we're seeing of if someone is feeling alienated already, and then they find this force that is human-like sort of, but at the very least you can feel connected to that artificial thing, but then that thing that now you somehow trust is the only thing you're going to for some sort of support. That cyclical nature is really just whatever technology had before and now amped up to another level. That's how I think about it, at least.
Thanks. Avi Rose from the Bay asks, thinking about the potential impact on helping people come to terms with the finality of a loved one's death. Now, maybe not quite final in the AI world. Like, does dead not mean dead anymore? If I can continue to have a chat exchange with grandma based on the texts that we exchanged while she was alive.
Yeah. I mean, this is why this, as a research area, really excites me, because these are some big, also as a minister, honestly, these are some big questions that I don't see as completely new questions, but I do see as a new form or entry point for asking some of these questions about closure. In my conversations with psychologists, I will say that this, and therapists, this is the main concern of whether extending this relationship in a way where even everyone, like if everyone knows that this is not real, this person is not like resurrected, but it feels like they are to some degree, to what degree is that that extension, is that like helpful versus harmful? But at the same time, that goes into this whole history within psychology literature of extended grief and ambiguous grief, and whether keeping that relationship alive versus trying to just like cut it off and not continue to be in relationship with like cleaning out your attic versus being able to go up into your attic to revisit. There's like psychology back and forth through decades and decades. So it's just continuing a new form of that conversation is how I see it.
Right. We can digitize all of my father-in-law's letters, but it's easier to keep them in hard copy in boxes and offsite storage so that we can interact with them in a tangible way. Question sent to me directly. What from a rabbi of a congregation? What kind of technological literacy do you think clergy and caregivers should seek to have that maybe they didn't need in prior generations? Like, we're not learning this in our clergy prep programs, or at least we weren't 5 years ago.
Yeah, I don't know if we are now. I think part of it is because we don't know the impact of some of this yet on the daily lives of our congregants. I think there's, so I'll speak for my own religious tradition. We are very, we skew older. We're smaller congregations overall. Like the congregation I led was around 1,000, and that's one of the larger ones, right? And there's already a tech literacy situation for our congregants of even being on like email listservs and some of the other things. And so this AI jump is actually complicating a lot within the congregation, but it's not entirely clear what that differential is across generations. But for clergy specifically, I think go find out more, be aware, and don't be scared of what's happening out there. I think the question then becomes, where are you getting your information? I think if you're going immediately to the sensationalist headlines on Wired, they're great. It's good to know what is happening, but they're doing it in order to get more clicks on that. And so I guess the two things I would say, one, it's still up in the air about where you should actually find your information. Some information is better than none. But two, to pay attention to some of the leadership in the religious space, like at Union Theological Seminary. And then I also believe at JTS, so the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, who are putting together whole clergy support platforms and classes to help people talk through that on the more day-to-day level. Which is a way to kind of sidestep your question, where like I have thoughts, but in terms of the actual like step-to-step, what should you know? It's very much in formation right now. I'd be curious to hear
Right. What I'm
from
hearing
you all,
from you
honestly.
is like we should seek information and we should be careful about where we're seeking it. And perhaps if we had training in a seminary, we might go back to them or other reputable seminaries who may be a step ahead of wherever we were trained to see what they're doing. A question from Amy Cunningham, funeral director here in New York and proprietor of Fitting Tribute Funeral Services, one of our sponsors. Thank you, Dylan. A lot of the new funeral home softwares that help directors with their accounting, their record keeping, their website management now have AI tools for writing obituaries.
Yeah.
Almost everyone initially dislikes this notion, but maybe for families who struggle to write anything while grieving, perhaps there's some merit? So hard to know. Talk to us about obituaries, AI.
Yeah. Obituaries are tricky because they are something that AI is really, really good at. What AI is really good at is feeding in a bunch of information and summarizing it. And so if you have all of these different pieces of information that you as a family member don't want to go back through, either because of the emotional toll it can take or because it's just so much, actually putting that information into some sort of ChatGPT-ish software is really good at synthesizing the information. Now, is it really good at the other things that writing obituaries give us, which is actually having to confront some of these transitions or some of the more difficult parts of a loved one dying? I think it short circuits it a little bit, is my opinion on it. But in talking to people at funeral homes, it makes their job easier. Like they're busy. And so there's an efficiency element there. But I think there's a bigger question of like, how do we think about that obituary writing as a task in our grief process?
I appreciate that. You know, as someone who reads a lot of obituaries to understand trends in the field and in our work, I've noticed the use of AI to create an obituary that wasn't created as an obituary, meaning like the gathering of information that's available about a young person who died, and all of a sudden becomes an obituary online that wasn't written by the family, probably wouldn't have been approved by them. You know, I've noticed it after the death of a young person where, you know, the family was shocked by the death and there wasn't much information available. And, you know, the internet came to fill in some of the gaps, but wasn't always like right about it. So I think there's, you know, definitely opportunities in terms of the workload and getting obituaries written when perhaps the family's involved, but also some dangers in what happens without our consent.
Yeah, well, and I'll say that it really depends on where that data is coming from. So there are some companies or websites that will just say, hey, we're going to write an obituary because people will click on it because of ad revenue. There's all this stuff that happens. But like, as we know about AI models, they hallucinate a lot, meaning they can just make stuff up because they want to, again, be people pleasing and give us the information. That's a real concern here.
Yeah. Question from Rabbi Justin Kerber in Indianapolis. Wouldn't AI chatbots be a natural fit for people experiencing various forms of dementia? Wouldn't this be a more affirming use of the tech? You see anything happening in dementia care yet?
I see a lot of questions and less so answers. I think there's a lot of folks proposing using AI for memory recollection and prompting in terms of dementia support. I am not the expert on dementia support in AI. I definitely have some colleagues I could point you to. I think there are promising potential use cases, but then you still have the issue of, I think with that one, it's really what is the issue of what we would call the human in the loop. So who is the clinician that would be supervising that? What are the prompts there that you would be giving the chatbot? Do you have someone who is designing the chatbot, or is it just kind of like out of the box, say coming from a place like Microsoft, where, you know, it might be pulling from all these different places. It's really like there's some very, I think, technical questions around that, that I wish I was seeing more design work there being done with people who are dementia experts and with psychologists and clinicians.
Fair. Somewhat relatedly, this is a comment, but I'll turn it into a question from Sherry Haber in New Jersey. Perhaps a grief bot could be useful in cases of traumatic death by helping people get closure and take additional time to let go of the loved one ripped suddenly from them. What are you seeing in terms of AI and grief support and trauma in particular?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of trepidation, actually, I would say, more than anything, around traumatic support. I think in the field, what I'm seeing from therapists is that that is the place where there's a lot of, oh, that might be, I see sort of what the comment's saying, like I see how that could be really beautiful and help people be able to continue that conversation, similar to this either narrative therapy or writing letters to a deceased loved one, which is used a lot in trauma support. But I'm hearing them saying that might be nice, but no. Basically, like this, because of the additional, same with ambiguous loss, the actual, like, in practice, they want to be using the tools that they know how to use, and they're not seeing the value add of bringing in this other tool, and especially paying for another tool, where trauma support needs to be so, like, one-on-one and interpersonal and tailored to the patient. So I think that's the duality that we're seeing there.
Right. Our friend Birgitta Kastenbaum from Los Angeles, death doula, reminds us of the humanizing nature of a lot of the work that many of us do. And, you know, that's where the opportunity for us to do our work better and differently and more of it, perhaps, can counter some of the dangers or the worries that we have about AI. A question of a different, go ahead, please.
Could I just adding quickly? I saw, believe it's Jeanette, maybe Jeanette, who wrote "A ghost will never replace a hug," and I think for me as a chaplain, that is something that I've thought a lot about. Even, like, you know, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, when we were thinking about, like, well, what does telephone chaplaincy look like? And I was like on the forefront of being like, no, we can't do that. Like, no, it has to be the in-person. The embodiment part of this, I think, is really interesting for us to think through, of what that hug means versus, like, a chat. So even the modalities of how we're giving grief support, I think, really matter for us to talk about.
We got a call not too long ago from some folks in the Midwest who are offering online chaplaincy support, and curious how we might partner, and what does it look like if the hospital contracts, you know, an online chaplaincy provider. You mentioned this in terms of people worrying about jobs, and the patient is handed an iPad, which is different than the bedside chaplaincy visit, where you and I were both taught a ministry of presence. Presence through an iPad is different than presence in my fullness of body. You know, we're breathing the same air.
And COVID changed a lot of that with our healthcare providers. I saw someone mention insurance as well, which also is hugely at play behind all of this.
Yeah. So speaking of money, a question from Jackie Maris, at the risk of sounding like a Luddite and Killjoy, she says, how is the industry thinking about the ecological impacts of AI, tech's use of water, accelerating our climate crisis, and she quotes, pulling deaths from the future, to use Beatrice Adler Bolton's phrase?
So within this grief bot space, generative ghost space specifically, not a lot of movement on that. In terms of general AI, technology, policy, all of that stuff, it is of huge interest, both in terms of caring for our planet, but then also national security is the other interesting part. So the U.S. cares, the U.S. has policies in which they are caring a lot about developing data centers in ways that are sustainable. But what sustainability looks like to different groups, to environmental groups versus people who are looking for strictly innovation and building things quickly, are very different. I would say in the academic space, there are lots of people now going out and trying to determine what are ways that we can be more aware and conscious as we're building out these data centers, because it does require lots of water to run any of these models. Europe is doing a much more intentional job. I won't say much better job necessarily, but doing a much more intentional job of taking that into account in their policy making itself. Let some of my bias out about how
fair.
certain policy
is
running.
Why we invited you here. I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to be in conversation with you today. I'm going to bring our formal conversation to a close here, but I know that you do welcome people to be in touch with you, and we will provide information in our follow-up emails so that those who wish to reach out and engage with your work can do so. It's really been a treat, a treasure, a pleasure to be in conversation with you. And I look forward to our work continuing to overlap in lots of new ways.
Right. Well, thank you all so much for having me. And I do hope that you take this as a provocation more than something that is prescriptive. But thank you so much for the questions as well. They're getting my brain thinking on some of these really complex topics.